COVID-19 edition. I'm actually in the auditorium at the college where we would normally all be. But, unfortunately this year, the rest of you, have to be with us virtually. Nonetheless, we have a great list of speakers and panelists beginning today with Peter joining us and making very interesting and compelling presentations for the duration of the festival, right? So before I hand things over and I introduce Professor Peter Stoett to you guys, a few words, right? So when I was given the mandate to organize this year's festival, I looked out there in the world and I thought to myself, hey, there's so many things going on which are kind of troubling. Environmental crises, crises with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous issues, visible minority crises, women, the destitute, the pandemic, various things going on in the world. And when I looked out there, I told myself, well, a lot of these things seem to be creating fractures, right? Divisions rather than unifying or creating solidarity, right? So I thought to myself, maybe it's time for us to take a harder look at community and the notion or idea of community. And that might be sort of something that would pull us back in the other direction, because these things that are happening out there all have the power to unify us as much as they do to divide us, right? So I thought maybe community might be a theme that brings us back in the, solidarity or unification area of things, as opposed to, division or fracture, right? So in that sense, right, we have a whole bunch of panelists or speakers that are going to speak to us about community, but from various perspectives. And it's fitting that the person who's opening the festival this morning, Dr. Stoett, is going to talk to us about environment, because to me, environment is the most pressing issue and matter out there. The very ecosystem that we, that we rely on to live and be alive, we keep compromising, and we don't seem to be able to clue in that, action is required quickly and more urgently than the type of actions or policies that we're implementing right now, right? So which brings me now to Peter. It's a great delight for me to introduce Peter. I was his undergraduate student, I was his graduate student, I was his research assistant, I was his teaching assistant. Peter was a mentor to me. And then I eventually became his colleague at Concordia when I used to teach there. And he eventually became my boss in a certain sense, because he was the chair of the department as well when I taught there. Somebody that I've admired and looked up to. It was fantastic when Peter accepted my invitation, and even more fantastic that he'd be the person to start things off for us and kick off the festival, right? Peter's an expert in international relations and environmental politics and issues surrounding the environment. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Peter, but before I do, once Peter's presentation is finished for the attendees, you'll be able to access the Q&A feature, and we're going to have a Q&A after the presentation is over, so you can ask Peter some questions that he'll be able to answer.
I think I'm unmuted now, yeah?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
It's all yours, Peter.
Oh, thank you.
All right.
And it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm going to try and put this share screen thing on, but I'm not having too much success with it right presently. But I think you've got the presentation ready there, so you can run with it, yeah? Yes, just 1 second, sorry.
We'll try and put it up in a second, Peter.
Oh, we should be okay. Are we on now?
Yeah, I could see you, but not your screen yet.
Oh, you can't? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's supposed to be working, but these things don't always, as we know, it doesn't always happen, right?
Yep.
So maybe we can just put yours up then, if you'd like, if you've got one that
Yeah, give me just a moment. Let me try and get it up, okay?
Sure. I can say a few words while we start here.
Okay.
I'm Very pleased to be here, and it's great to see Era in this playing this role of running or at least organizing this conference. And I think he's chosen a very apt theme for the times that we face today. I'm presently in Geneva, Switzerland. Well, I'm actually in northern France, but close to Geneva. And um, we are at present dealing with multiple crises, of course, with climate change going on and different environmental issues. The one that I'm most focused on probably is that of biodiversity loss. And there are various causes for biodiversity loss. And I don't want to give the impression today that environmental crime is the number one cause. It's not by any means, but it's up there. And we have bigger problems that we face, believe it or not, about land use change and other issues. I also work extensively on invasive alien species, for example, and the impact they have on the environment. One of the things about being in Geneva, and I don't work here permanently, I'm here mainly because my wife's currently working with the World Health Organization, but there are various international organizations in Geneva, as you might know, that work on the environment and other issues. And one of them, perhaps the most prominent, is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And I was, in fact, this morning discussing with the director of enforcement of the CITES treaty the various problems that we face when it comes to saving endangered species and how we can deal with them. And what often gets lost, and what I'd like to talk about today more than anything else, I think, is the fact that these are these are problems that require community-based solutions. They can't be solved from a distance. They can't be solved from space or from, with using satellites. All this technology that we have today can help us a great deal. But ultimately, environmental crime, climate change, biodiversity loss, many of these issues that we face today, and you'll hear so much about, are really dependent on community actions in order to get past them. So that's why I titled the talk today, "Can We Turn It Around?" I'm not seeing the individual screen. We've got the next slide on there as well. Can you make it so that we're only seeing the individual screens? Is that possible?
Peter,
Hmm.
I see the share screen, and I think our attendees see the share screen. I think you're the only one for some reason that can't see it because your presentation is actually up. So I don't know. Um,
Okay, well, it's up, but I can just see that there's. Okay, that's fine. So let's just move ahead then.
I
It's good.
just you just have to sort of cue me, when you want me
Yeah.
to change
Okay.
the slides. All right.
Yeah. So let's just move into it. And
All
how long
right.
do I have, Aaron?
About 20 minutes.
Okay.
If you
So
go
there
over a
we
little bit,
go.
it's fine. Yeah.
Let's get moving then.
All right.
So we just want to move on.
All right. So next slide. Okay. There we go. Yep.
Okay. Um, so yeah, what is it? What is environmental crime? Yeah, and there's different definitions of this, of course, and questions about what it entails precisely. But there's no question that right now it's in the news a lot. The COVID-19 pandemic, to some extent, has been traced to a wildlife market, as you might know, in China. Now, there's some dispute about this, and it's not by any means certain that that's where it came from, that it came from the market, so to speak. It probably is a zoonotic disease which originated in bats, perhaps was transferred to another species. That species might have been traded legally or illegally and ended up infecting a human after it mutated and so on. So there's different explanations, of course, but nonetheless, it's become very popular on the news to talk about COVID-19 as originating because of the wildlife trade. So it's a welcome attention in a sense because this topic's so often obscured. It's very unwelcome origin of the intention because it entails a global pandemic, which we've seen and which, of course, is why we're not meeting in person today. Um, but I don't want to give the impression that environmental crime is just about the wildlife trade, although that might be the most popular image we have of poached elephants and rhinos, traded, gorilla uh, parts, and so on. It also includes illegal fisheries, which is a massive, massive illegal industry worth billions and billions a year. Illegal forestry and trade in endangered timber, which is probably the biggest source of environmental crime that we face. The dumping of hazardous waste and electronic waste, and carbon fraud as we move into an age when we're trying to convince people to reduce their carbon footprint. We know very for certain that, in fact, a lot of criminal activity has been associated with this. I'm happy to expand on any of this as we move along, but we should, or after, but we should get to the next slide, please. And I will, okay, Era, can we move to the next slide? Yeah. If you can just let me know I've moved, because on my Zoom I'm not even seeing that we've moved. So I don't know why. I seem stuck in another world here. But anyway.
Yeah, well, I'm in the spheres of eco violence.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, all right.
Just say okay once you've moved the
Yep,
screen forward.
perfect. Yep.
Um, Era and I are used to improvising at Concordia University for many years, in one way or the other. Um, yeah, I wouldn't be a good academic or true to myself if I didn't plug a book. So this is the book that's coming out, in fact, in a couple months. It's published by Palgrave. It's called Spheres of Transnational Ecoviolence, and in this book we sort of cover a lot of the environmental crimes that I just mentioned, and talk about various international solutions. But the reason we use the term transnational ecoviolence is because these are, in fact, internationally linked crimes. Organized criminal outfits, international money laundering, convergence with other crimes such as human trafficking, gun smuggling, drug smuggling. It's all out there. It's not the stuff of make believe or a Netflix film. It's true. The linkages are quite disturbing. They're worldwide, and they always involve violence against humans. It's not just violence against nature. In fact, one of the things we do in this book is set out to prove that it doesn't matter what environmental crime you're looking at, we can link it to human exploitation one way or the other. Often it's exploitation of Indigenous people and local communities. So that brings us back to the topic of today. Next slide, please. Again, these are the different spheres that we focus on in the book, from wildlife trade to forestry, mining. Mining is linked to child labor, as many of you know. With regard to fishing, 20 to 40% of all fish caught, we estimate, is caught illegally. Bycatch deaths of cetaceans in the hundreds of thousands. Cetaceans are whales, by the way, and dolphins, which we all adore, of course. But also, sea slavery is one of the most common forms of slavery today. So people that are stuck in illegal fishing boats that have left their communities to make money, to try and send money back to their homes. Hazardous waste dumping from industrial waste clearly involves harm to human beings in the local area. And then there's the climate crimes we mentioned, which, of course, and to a certain extent, you can argue, hurt us all, right? But hurt some more than others. Next slide. The next slide here is simply, this is the conventional image we have, right? This is a ranger from Africa in an African state who's holding a rhino horn that's been severed and recovered from an illegal poaching operation. We tend not to show faces of rangers if we can avoid it. Sometimes they like their faces shown, but usually they don't. I've been down there in Africa. I've spent some time in some of these camps, and they like to be anonymous because when they go back to their community, they don't like people necessarily to know that they could be opposed to poachers the next day. So it gives you a sense that it's a violent industry. There's a lot of violence between them. I was at a safari camp once where a poacher was shot. So these things do happen. But if you turn to the next slide, Era, this is in fact the more likely scenario. This is what environmental crimes really look like. This is some illegal forestry burning in the Amazon. And Often it is legal, of course, so it's not always illegal in the sense. And you have changes in governments, which makes these things more legal than previously. But the growth of palm tree plantations, for example, burning down forests in order to put up cattle farms and so forth. This is where the environmental crime really affects people and affects local communities, destroys the habitat they're reliant on, destroys the species they're reliant on. Very important from a biodiversity perspective. So next slide. I won't take too much time on this, but just very quickly, it's widely understood now that environmental crime is up there with the international drug trade. It's up there with arms. It's up there with human trafficking and wildlife crime. These are basically the big four right now. There's a fifth, of course, which is money laundering, but money laundering is associated with all of these crimes. But the estimates, and you might be frustrated as students of social science, you might want more precision, but the estimates run anywhere from 120 to 300 billion dollars per year globally in terms of revenues. But that's just part of it. It's not just about revenues that these international criminal organizations are pulling in. It's also the lost revenue, right, that governments aren't making when they can't properly tax products, for example. There's another element, of course, which is less tangible. It's very difficult to measure. What is the loss of the species worth? What is extinction worth in terms of dollar value? And there's a big debate that goes on and on amongst conservationists about how much of a dollar value we should attribute to individual species. But that being said, lost revenues for governments in the billions, that's for sure, right? And I do put a note of caution there that we have to be careful. We don't want governments reliant on revenue necessarily from, for example, ivory tusks. Okay, so yeah, we have to be careful about that. But that being said, there's no question that the lost revenue is tremendous, and I'll get back to that momentarily. Every continent except Antarctica. So far, we've managed to avoid Antarctica, but the people carrying out the real work, yeah, the small-time poachers, the fishermen, coerced laborers, truck drivers, store owners, we can go on and on. But the people making the money, of course, are the ones at the top, right? These are the ones that facilitate the trade and do the end sale, basically. And then, of course, illegal products get sold in small stores, and again, you're back down again. So it sort of works like this. It's a pyramid, if you wish, right, in terms of who pulls the most money in. It's the middlemen that pull the most money in, as we call them. And one of the biggest factors, and we talked about this morning when I was speaking with the CITES people, they don't like to talk about this, but the reality is government corruption is so prevalent that it's very difficult to root it out. So if we're relying on governments to stop this nefarious trade, or if we're relying on international organizations, I think we're in trouble because neither of them have proven up to the task. We do have some evidence, however, that at the community level, that's where things really get done. So I won't go on in much more detail about that. We can just keep moving, Aaron. The ecological impacts of environmental crime, very serious. Large-scale ecocide in some cases. We're draining the oceans of fish right now. That has an impact on the entire ocean ecosystem, not just on those fish species that we're actually draining. And many of that, of course, is legal fisheries that take place, but a lot of it, again, as I said, up to 40%. Think about that, 40%, right? Almost impossible to tell when you go to a seafood restaurant and order fish, whether it was caught legally or not. Now, there are some people in the fishing industry that would dispute that with me. But for the most part, there's no doubt that there's some uncertainty involved. Key species are reduced, and that affects all local wildlife. So when you take out a keystone species like a tiger because of poaching, you're going to affect the entire ecosystem because, as you might know, there's a sense of balance, right, that's maintained by top predators. Spread of pathogens and invasive diseases. Again, illegal mining operations, illegal timber operations are exposing the people that are working in those areas to new pathogens, to new viruses that we human beings have yet to be exposed to in some cases. And we know that can be, in fact, the spread of zoonosis in something like COVID-19. Long-term toxicity from dumps. And again, and I'm working with the United Nations Environmental Program now. We're working on a program or a project, a research project, where we're actually going to try to measure this for the first time, because no one's ever measured the contribution to climate change, the emissions, carbon dioxide, and so on, of greenhouse gases, which comes from the overall picture of environmental crime. But we suspect it's tremendous. We suspect it's a good 20-30% perhaps of the emissions that are out there, right? Now that might just be hyperbole on my part, but I'm pretty sure the numbers are going to be astounding when we actually figure this out. That project is to come, and it'll be a while. Next slide, please. If we look at local human impacts, however, it's even more acute. Violence, the murder of activists is very common. Places like Mexico and so on, we're seeing more and more. Drug cartels have always been, of course, nasty pieces of work. What we're seeing now are avocado cartels, and cartels that are linked to the production of fruits, which are then sold to the United States. People that are opposing this because it destroys natural habitat and biodiversity are being killed. There's been an increasing number of environmental activists murdered over the past 10 years or so around the world, not just in Mexico or places where we know there's a high criminal activity, but around the world it's happening. So we have to be very, I think, acutely aware of the violence associated with this. Not only that, but communities can get dependent on organized crime networks. So that they need them for income and so forth. I mentioned exposure to dangerous pathogens and the destruction of ecotourist opportunities. Right? As charismatic species decline in some areas, you can't sell people tickets anymore, to go see the gorillas or whatever it is that's making some money for you. Next slide, please. So the drivers of environmental crime include, of course, poverty. Poverty is a main driver of everything. There are medical myths in terms of, buy this shark fin soup and it'll make you impotent, or sorry, more potent. It'll cure impotence, or tiger bone or whatever. Right? There's different theories about this, of course, and different beliefs. We know that for the most part these are mythologies, but nonetheless they persist. But there's bigger factors really too. There's political expediency. There's politicians which need the support basically of some of these large organizations and use them. Conflicts. Right? Some of the areas where we find a high rise in environmental crime are also areas where we've had civil war, like the Democratic Republic of Congo in Africa, Honduras in Central America. I could go on. So and also let's not forget about this. A lot of these crimes are actually perpetrated by corporations, right? Be they Western or from other countries. It's not always these bad, the mafia and so on, that's conducting these corporate or these environmental crimes. There's often corporations involved, and of course they don't like to admit that and so on. And sometimes their involvement is peripheral. It's not central. They're not the central investors in it, but they're benefiting from it. So this is a factor we have to keep in mind. Aaron, next slide. So national responses, basically, fines and penalties have not been up to it. If you mistreat an animal in Montreal today, you can in fact be fined pretty severely and in some cases even jailed for that. So there are some animal rights fines that have come up that are pretty improving with time. But crimes against the environment are still not treated as seriously as they should be in many cases. And again, one of the reasons why is exactly the reasons I already stated, that there is some government involvement in some of these crimes in some countries, and there's corporations involved in others. But we have to get past that and actually make this a serious crime. And we're talking about ways to do that. Last week we had a conference of the parties of the United Nations Treaty on Organized Crime. And one of the things we're trying to get there is for governments around the world to actually give environmental crime the sort of penalty rates that they should equal to drug transfers or arms transfers or other forms of clandestine illegal activity. But increasingly, we're seeing a response on the national level towards militarization, where we're bringing more and more guns in to solve the problem. We're hiring more soldiers to come in and solve the problem. And these raise issues. They alienate local communities. They use conservation as a tool to establish political dominance instead of actually achieving some sort of environmental harmony. And there's, lots of problems with this militarization answer, and it's understandable. People are upset. But in the case of the tiger, for example, in India, there's been a very militarized response to this, so that it reaches a point, though, where you're dealing with difficult governments in some cases, where the claim can be made that, well, we're just trying to protect the tiger, when what we're really doing, in fact, is establishing military dominance in a region, right? So they lack legitimacy is the term that we use in political science. Aaron's probably told you about, those of you in his classes that probably mentioned that term. Aaron, can we go to the next, please? Community responses. This is, I think, this is where we've been saying this for many years now. This is where we need answers. Most activism on environmental crime comes from the grassroots level. It doesn't come from national politicians who can only see 4 years ahead. It comes from people that are living in the actual habitat that's under stress. Local control of resources, essential. Here I'm referring to Elinor Ostrom's notion of common pool resources and collective self-governance. That's one of those things that you'll learn a lot about at university, but it's an important notion that there are certain things that we can see in common, that where where local communities actually do self-govern very effectively, contrary to the mythology that we need national governments and international governments to tell us what to do. So backyards are the important spaces when it comes to environmental crime. That's where it's got to stop. And of course, there is lots of room for funding. Green jobs should include local policing and forensics for environmental crime. And we can hire people to do work in those areas. That's all very good. But the people that we hire should be local and should have a good understanding of the local context. Next slide. I always especially highlight the role of Indigenous people. They are, after all, the custodians of over 2/3 of terrestrial biodiversity. And then this includes coastal regions too, which are often ignored but shouldn't be. And we do have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which affords them free and prior informed consent. If we just let them run things, we'd all be better off. I think many of us would agree on that. We also have, of course, various international instruments that are designed to ensure that Indigenous people do have that impact, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity and Nagoya Protocol. I won't get into the details of these, but what it all comes down to really is the value of Indigenous knowledge. It's something that we really stress at the IPIS work that I do in the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And yet at the same time, many of the people that I mentioned before that are murdered, that are involved in confrontations with environmental crime syndicates, in fact, are Indigenous people, and they're the least protected members of society. And this is probably the case most objectively in South America, parts of Africa, parts of Asia, but you can also make similar comparisons to what's happened in parts of Canada and elsewhere. Next slide, Aaron. So just very quickly, I know I'm running out of time, just in terms of some very quick solutions or possibilities as well. Ecotourism is often put forth as a real savior here. And there's no question about the damage that's caused by conventional tourism. I mean that's almost inestimable in terms of what that's done to local environments. So I'm certainly not trying to suggest that ecotourism is as bad as that. It's not, quite clearly, right? It can be a green source of income for local communities. But you have to be worried about dependence on it as well. I was at a seminar last week where the estimate right now is that $29 billion has been lost in revenue in African countries due to COVID-19 alone. So, in other words, ecotourism is wonderful, but as soon as travel becomes impossible, as soon as northerners basically can't spend their money to come and enjoy these environmental wonders that they do, the loss is going to be very severe. And we've seen that this year, in fact. It's just been devastating. So relying on the affluent, there's sustainability issues there. There's also this question, of course, and this is very controversial, as many of you know, about trophy hunting. I go back and forth on this myself even. So, I certainly personally do not have a great deal of respect for someone who wants to go in an enclosed area and find an animal and kill it. But that being said, trophy hunting does bring considerable cash to local areas, and if that's used properly, if the hunting is done sustainably, right, then if we get past the moral argument about hunting, which of course is a much bigger argument that has to do with human nature relations and so on, trophy hunting can be quite important for local economies. That being said, it raises the same problems. You're still relying on the whims of the affluent, if you will. Era, the next one. So I won't go over this in detail at all because we're running out of time. These are just some international conventions that have been created, that including Interpol, of course, which is the international police, which is not the police as you know it within your community, but it is more of a communication device, but nonetheless. And then there are many NGOs that are involved in this, of course, and they do great work in terms of measuring, monitoring, and so on. However, at the same time, they clearly have not solved the problem. Next era. So I come back again to citizen engagement, which is a good community start. Hiring local for monitoring and forensics when it comes to various types of environmental crime is essential. Educational campaigns at the community level are essential. If people don't know what the long-term costs of environmental crime in their areas, in their own neighborhood is, they're less likely to act. If they are aware of that, then they're more likely, of course, to take very proactive measures. Limit police and military support. Use it when it's requested only, as opposed to having it look like an imposition that's come. And citizen science, which is something you might have heard of too. This is important, I think, because the more citizens you can get engaged in the scientific measurement of these problems, this would be a good thing. There's places in Africa, for example, where carbon offsets funding for cell phone data is being used. Right? So that we'll pay for people's cell phone data through offsets that when we use carbon for local observations and reporting. This has happened because it's not something that's easy to do to tell a community. Please report your local environmental criminals, right? It's difficult, right? It has to be sort of a whistleblowing approach. And also, of course, when it comes to identifying and reporting invasive species, for example, right? There's apps for that now, but we have to find creative ways to pay for their implementation. Next slide. This is just a photo of a local community, trying to put something positive out there about what can be done in a coastal region, but I won't spend time. So if we can just move on, Era. I'm almost through. We need that old phrase that we've all heard bandied about so many times, but I think it still applies. So the paradigm shift is something that's very welcome, to recognize the fundamental importance of community action and organization and self-governance. Self-governance is a word that makes a lot of governments shake. They don't like that term, but nonetheless, it has to be discussed, I think, to fight a local problem, which in the aggregate is a global catastrophe. Right? I think that's the proper way to look at environmental crime. They are local problems with international connections, but in the aggregate, they compose a global catastrophe. Community should be linked back to local ecology, without this sort of green authoritarianism, military-style approach. And Indigenous communities need to be protected, respected, and consulted for advice. And I would add this, I think this is very important, and again, to re-stress the book that I mentioned previously, we draw the link directly to human exploitation here. Community-based economies should become the norm instead of sort of desperate and coerced labor, which is tied to the global economy. That, as you probably know, is a much bigger challenge. And then I think the final slide, Aaron, if you could just turn to that. Yes. So I like coming up with quotes that sound great and sort of encapsulate what we're saying. And I thought, who better to quote than Era himself? So I'm doing this primarily to embarrass him, but also because I think it's just a wonderful quote. And Era, of course, is just a brilliant writer, so it's always been easy. And this is from his dissertation, which he didn't write with me, but he went on to write in Wales. And he wrote that the themes of poverty, inequality, and precariousness, which are common denominators in all manifestations of bondage, are also symptoms of the darker aspects of modern-day globalized capitalist economies. As long as they are not effectively mitigated and they place individuals at a relative disadvantage when it comes to bargaining their terms of service, involuntary labor practices will be perceived as having a comparative advantage, and exploitation and bondage will persist. And what I'm asking really you to do is take this quote, this basic theme, where people really need to find work, they need to provide for their families. If the only source of income they can find is engaging in environmental criminality, they will do it. And we demonstrate that in the book, I think, and I've tried to demonstrate that in this presentation. The way around this is to make sure the communities are empowered and the communities have their own economic planning and futures that they can look at. So, and there's one more slide where I think, yes, I just say thank you. And my email is there. I'm very happy to discuss this with people. I'm also on Twitter. I tweet a lot of stuff about environmental crime, that's for sure, if you're interested. So I'll let it go there. Thank you very much for turning the slides.
All right. Thank you very much, Peter. Yes, and thank you for making it a point to embarrass me with the quote.
Pleasure.
I haven't. While you were reading that, I was like, did I actually write that? Because it's been such a long time. I haven't revisited my dissertation, but it was a good quote, I guess. Yeah. So, folks, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Very interesting stuff. Not very uplifting, sometimes, but nonetheless the reality, and which stresses the need and urgency for us to, get our rears into gear and, apply more pressure as communities on our governments and, our corporations, because as Peter said, I don't think the solution, or we should rely for solutions in these areas on, governments and corporations, right? It has to come from community, as Peter stressed, right? So now we're at the point where you get to ask Peter questions. Okay, so we have a Q&A feature that's on the webinar. So please feel free, any questions, any comments that you'd like to make related to the presentation. Obviously, the floor is open now. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll read through your questions. I encourage all of you to ask any questions. Don't be shy. There are no such thing as stupid questions. Obviously, if you're thinking of something, probably the next person next to you is thinking of the same thing, right? And maybe, and this is where, you don't need to be shy because you're not here in person and we can't see you. So please, the floor is open. Okay, so here we go, Peter. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, yeah.
Okay, all right. So first question.
Yeah.
Many students are interested in working in intergovernmental agencies. A lot of them are curious about working in the United Nations, how to get there, and what the work looks like. Can you tell us more about your position, your day-to-day tasks, and the challenges of intergovernmentalism?
Sure. I mean, as I said, I don't work for an intergovernmental agency directly. I work with one very closely right now, which is this intergovernmental platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services, otherwise known as IPBES, and with the United Nations Environmental Program. I have a few projects going with them. And I mentioned too, my wife works with the World Health Organization, for example. So I'm pretty familiar with people that work for intergovernmental agencies. Yeah, it's really important, I think, that you don't get worried too directly about what sort of program you take as an undergraduate. You can get to that space through a variety of routes. Right? So there's no, you don't have to go and study international organizations to actually work in one day. Um, Typically, I think I would always stress the significance of taking some international relations courses. Of course, I mean that's pretty self-evident, I think. But if you want to be a scientist and you want to end up working with an international organization, then go for it. You know, you don't feel like you have to have a social science background in order to do that. But the converse is true as well. You don't need to have a scientific background necessarily. A lot of that stuff you'll learn through osmosis, anyways, right, as you're working with an organization like this. Um, there's various degrees are helpful, but in today's day and age, let's face it, you've got to think long term about a graduate degree. Right? So it won't be an undergraduate degree that's going to get you there. Chances are you'll also have to have at least a master's level, and you might want to think even further about doing a PhD or what have you. More and more PhDs now are very practical in their orientation. They're less about the scholarly impact, and more about even holding an internship in an international organization, for example, is not impossible. So yeah, and day-to-day tasks. This is different for everyone, so it's really hard to answer that. I can tell you about the challenges of intergovernmentalism and again, this comes up in the environmental crime field all the time. Um, Governments basically are the sovereign representatives of states, and they're not inclined to letting international organizations tell them what to do. It's a constant struggle. I mean, there are cases where some national governments actually use international organizations to try and get their way or try and lead on certain issues. And if you like the issues, that's great. If you don't, you hate them, right? So that's how that works. There's also, of course, to be blatant about it, today, there's a decided, I think, in the last 10 years, shift away from multilateralism in terms of the prevailing governments of the day. Right? So we've seen this in the UK, we've seen it in Russia, we've seen it in the United States, we've seen it in Brazil. Canada was that way for quite some time, and then sort of switched the other way with the Liberals coming into power. But there's one of the biggest challenges of intergovernmentalism or multilateralism right now are the governments that feel that international organizations are in fact nothing more than interfering, as opposed to possible areas where we can find solutions.
All right, thank you, Peter. Well, there's somebody that's asking, in your expert
Yeah,
opinion, where do you
yeah.
think the COVID-19
I,
virus
I
actually comes from?
yeah, I think for that you need to speak to epidemiologists and people in the medical community. But what they're saying basically right now is they still don't know either. There's one thing that we're pretty sure of though, is that the controversy let me put it this way, the conspiracy theories that are out there that the Chinese did this to slow down the world economy or whatever. I mean, that's not taken very seriously by anyone who knows about it. But certainly it's zoonotic, and but as I said in my presentation, probably from a species of bat that might have been transferred to another species, which was then transferred to a human. But again, I'm not the right one to speculate on that.
All right, so we'll move on. So this, I think, the what can one individual, I think the stress should be on the one individual in this question. So what can one individual do to reduce the impact of climate crimes?
Well, here, if we take a broader definition of crime, obviously, then everything you do is so important, right? In order to reduce your own footprint. So yeah, try to limit, of course, how much carbon you burn yourself, right? That's the basic answer there. But in terms of some of the more specific climate crimes we're looking at, a lot of it has to do with vigilance and oversight. Right? So we had a major carbon crime that was committed by Volkswagen, for example, when they lied about their pollution abatement equipment. They were sued billions of dollars for this and fined and so on. Somehow the company survived. But if we've got if we insist that governments are very vigilant and the overwatch on the regulations that they themselves have put forward, hopefully we can avoid situations where corporations feel they can get away with that. Another thing is, of course, these. When I put the picture up there of the illegal forestry going on and the deforestation and the burning of wild areas, it's not done for fun. It's done so that they can mine the area or that they can grow products, which are then sold, right? And so just when you approach the marketplace as an individual, you should always have that in the back of your mind. What am I buying? Where is it from? What sort of legitimacy is attached to any sort of certification scheme that's been put forth for this product? I mentioned seafood before. That's a very difficult one, but there are some certification schemes that help us know what we're actually buying. So that's very important too. And in general, I think if you want to support community and sustainable development in communities, then make wise decisions when you purchase your clothes. If you are a tourist, once all this is done, you can finally travel again. Make sure you're careful. Where you go. Are you going to a place that's just exploiting local members or community members, or are you going to a place where there's actually a co-equal relationship when you visit it? So I could go on all day about this one, but I won't do that.
All right. Next question. How would you propose to increase local community engagement in protecting the environment in their community when they are struggling for personal resources and poverty?
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is in many ways this is the crux of the problem, right? It's one thing to infuse some money or some cash into a local economy, and then just expect it to naturally be spent in the proper way. It's another thing to go in and oversight again how that money is spent to the point where you can be accused of colonizing it. Yeah, so there's this sort of fine line that has to be drawn, I think. Now, for sure, there are things that we found over time that can increase local community engagement. But if people are living in a culture of fear, and you often get this with criminal groups in particular, it's very difficult to overcome that. You will have brave individuals, of course, that speak out. But in many cases, as I've already outlined today, tragically enough, they end up paying the price for doing that, right? Or their families do. So you need to have, and I'm not pretending we can just forsake law and order here. You need to have local policing that does protect people that actually speak out about these crimes. At the same time, you also need to invest in education. And of course, you need to invest, in my view, anyways. And I would say this, but you need to give people the opportunity to obtain post-secondary and college and/or university education, and go back to those communities and be leaders as well. I find that local leadership is essential. And if everyone who goes to university ends up living in the big city and never goes back to the community, that too is an issue.
Thank you. All right. So the next question is, if poverty is the main driver for environmental crimes, aren't solutions to this issue going to take too long to put in place, thus resulting in irreversible damages?
Yeah, so I'm not suggesting that we can't stop environmental crime until we completely eradicate poverty. If I felt that, then absolutely, yeah, this would be a futile exercise at this point. There are steps that can be taken, of course, in the short term. I mentioned, last week's efforts to try and get governments to take environmental crime more seriously in terms of the punishments, because there is a factor here of deterrence that we have to be concerned about. Right? So, you and I are not going to think twice about crossing, jaywalking or crossing a road, right? Against the red light, even if there's no cars coming and you're being safe about it. Most of us will do that. I know I'm speaking to people in Montreal, so you can't fool me. But if the fine for doing that was $10,000 or 6 months in jail, no, you would not be doing it. I can guarantee it. And that's sort of a similar situation that we face here. So there are short-term things that we need to do. It's very important that we have more information about the international networks that are driving this crime as well. It's very important that we deal with some of the other issues that are affected with organized criminal activity, like money laundering and so on. Things that it does take national governments and it takes international, such as Interpol, international organizations to work on. What I'm saying is that in the long run, though, those solutions have not proven sustainable. Right? Those are not long-term solutions. A long-term solution will necessitate, in my view, more local community development. And I'm generalizing here terribly. Right? So I'm not trying to present what a good social scientist would say, right, is an aggregate solution. I don't want to generalize too much. There are always differences. There's some areas where community development's been extremely strong, and really all it needs is a little bit of protection maybe for people that are willing to speak out. There are other areas where they're really starting from scratch almost in terms of the disarray, right, in their local economies that's resulted from war. I mentioned conflict earlier. So hard to deal in a post-conflict setting with environmental crimes. And we found this again and again, whether it was in East Timor or after the Vietnam War, after the war in the Second Gulf War, the war in Iraq, and so on. Very difficult to cope with environmental crime when you've got general chaos and other problems ensuing. So, yeah, in the long term, I don't think you can have solutions in areas like that until you have some sort of political stability.
All right, thank you, Peter. So the next question is, with the pandemic going on, how do you believe our economy is being affected? And do you believe that more people will become more likely to engage in environmental crimes due to a lack of jobs, hiring, as well as stores closing?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we spoke about this morning again with the individual from CITES I was talking, and it's going. There are different opinions on this. So on the one hand, we did expect to see a drop in environmental crime simply because the transportation of goods related to environmental crimes has become more difficult during COVID. On the other hand, and we've seen a drop, right, to some extent. It's always difficult to measure because you only know environmental crimes taking place when people get caught, right? And the vast majority of cases, people don't get caught. We're pretty sure of that. So it's like many other crimes in that regard. However, there's also the case, and I think that this is becoming more and more prevalent right now. More and more of the initial trade and the transactions are taking place on the internet. Right? And we're finding what we call cybercrime, or in some cases with the trade of invasive species or endangered species as well. This we think is increasing. So people are making deals, money's being transferred at an increased rate, and yet at the same time, the goods aren't being necessarily transferred at the same time, right? So there's a delay perhaps. So it's a very good question though, because I think that in some cases we can ask, what is the impact of COVID-19 on investigating these crimes and on generating the political will to do something about them? Right? And yeah, there was this initial rush maybe that where we saw many people concerned about, because if they link COVID-19 to illegal wildlife trade, for example, right? Boy, let's do something about illegal wildlife trade now. But that resulted too in a flurry of proposals, some of which didn't make much sense, like outlawing all wildlife trade, which would be very detrimental to many communities that rely on it and so forth. You can, however, make the argument that, yeah, policing services have been limited because of this, and there's been other cases that we're looking at now where, because of COVID-19, we don't have the same surveillance that we did have immediately prior to it. I think we'll get that back. I don't think that's going to be a long-term problem.
Right. We have about 5 more minutes. There's a couple of questions already up there on the board. So, is there international law about environmental crimes?
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, there's quite a bit of international law that exists now. I mentioned toxic waste trades, for example, and for that it's called the Basel Convention on Hazardous Waste, which outlaws most trade in hazardous waste across nations. There's also CITES, which is a convention on international trade in endangered species. Right? CITES is, of course, one of the more important ones when it comes to wildlife crime. Um, and I could go on for some time. I mean, there's quite a few conventions and treaties that are out there. Um, One of the problems is that the United Nations Treaty on Organized Crime that I mentioned previously does not explicitly mention environmental crime. And it has what are called protocols, which are more detailed and action oriented parts of conventions. And it has a protocol on, for example, um, human smuggling, right, and human trafficking. It has mainly sets up a protocol on drug trade and so forth. So there's an effort right now to get another protocol accepted, which will deal explicitly with environmental crime. And what came out of last week's meetings, from my understanding, amongst heads of state, was a willingness to look seriously at doing that now. That idea has been kicking around for a decade or whatever, but um, it's probably being taken more seriously now than ever. So there could be a slightly more formal and structured international legal regime around this. But again, I want to stress this. If that isn't coupled with enforcement, if it's not coupled with the surveillance of these international networks, and if it's not coupled with giving legitimacy to these laws in local communities, then I don't think it's going to make a big difference, frankly. So we still need this action at the local level if you're going to avoid the temptation, basically, to get people involved in this line of work.
All right. Well, it's a good general order question to finish it off. Somebody's asking you to look into your crystal ball as an expert, Peter. In your opinion, will we solve our environmental issues? Are you optimistic that climate change will be reversed or slowed down?
Yeah, well, I am cautiously optimistic, I think is the best way to put it. We're more aware of these problems than we've ever been. We've got more people working on these problems than ever. Highly talented people around the world in various capacities. The science is there. The politics has been a mess. I mean, let's face it. It's that simple. It's not that simple, but that's part of it, right? And I mentioned this previously. There's been this sort of I don't want to call it a right wing because that's too simplistic, but there's certainly been an anti-regulatory, to use a more precise term, sweep across many of the advanced industrial states. China continues to have governance problems. I'm very, it's heartening to see China's commitment, for example, to moving towards green technology. China's moving very rapidly right now. It's heartening to see changes in a lot of places in Europe and so on, but it's still, we're still far behind. Australia is another issue. You get a government in Australia that's basically staking its future on coal production still. So, yeah, I think that the politics is lagging here, the science, and we've got to try and close that gap somehow. We've got great activists like Greta and so on out there that are trying to get the word out, and that's wonderful. But we need governments to be a bit braver and a bit more committed, I guess, long term. Hopefully, we'll see a change in the fall in the United States situation. If we don't, that's going to be a real blow, I think, to any form of optimism that people might have. But we can't, again, let's not rely on national governments. Let's not rely on international organizations necessarily because they can only pretty well do what national governments tell them to. we have to go and deal with this at the local level, at the community level as well, and start to promote local governance that's able to say no to corporations. No, you can't do that here. You can't build that pipeline here. And these, as we know, these are politically contentious issues, and it's going to be problematic in the future, just as it was in the past. Overall, cautious optimism. Human beings solve problems. The main concern, of course, is that we also connect them, and or sorry, we also cause problems. Yes.
All right. Thank you very much, Peter. Well, I want to thank all of you who are in attendance or attended. I found your questions quite interesting, actually, challenging some of them. And thanks, Peter, for a stimulating and very informative, presentation. Great way to kick off this year's festival. So folks, the next one's at 11:30 in half an hour and deals with, mental health and the importance of community when it comes to mental health. So thanks again, Peter, and
My
hopefully
pleasure.
I'll see most of you in about a half an hour.